For the making of this video, I also used the book The Baron and the Settlements by Ran Aronson. This is because Goldstein, which we saw in the first part, deals with the political structure of Hibat Tzion and its inner struggles, while mostly ignoring the actual lives of the Jewish immigrants who moved to the Holy Land at the years 1881 to 1918. Most of his primary sources are letters between the heads of the group, Jewish newspapers in the Pale, where most Eastern European Jews lived, and manifestos. But Aronson's book also adds diary entries of Jews who immigrated to Israel in those years, like the very famous diary of Chaim Chisin, one of the Bilu members, of which I will speak in this video. The diary is available for free online in Hebrew and in Yiddish. As myriad small groups in Russia, Romania, and Ukraine decided to gather people to migrate to Israel, they were not united. Some groups focused on moving Jews to Ottoman southern Syria immediately, and I specifically use this term for the Holy Land because at the time it wasn't called Palestine. At the end of the 19th century, the place that we now call Israel was divided into several municipal units. Early Muslims, after they conquered the place in the 7th century, called it Asham, the left hand, meaning that it is on their left. And parts of this land that would later become the British Mandate on Palestine were called Al-Urdun, Philistine, and Dimashq. And all of these places are not one by one what is today Israel. For the Turks, for the Ottoman Turks, for example, what was the Beirut Vilayat included parts of northern Israel today and also parts of Syria and Lebanon, southern Lebanon today. What is today called Jerusalem, for example, was part of a municipal unit that also included parts of Jordan today, and what is today the Negev, the largest part of Israel, the southern part of Israel, was part of Sinai and parts of Jordan, meaning that today it would belong to Egypt. So I'm very careful not to call it Palestine or Israel, so let's call it the Holy Land. Sometimes I would refer to it as Israel because this is how the settlers view this land, but you must remember that the place wasn't called Palestine or Israel at the time by the people who controlled it, and the borders of it were not the borders that we have today of Israel. It was divided into very separate land units. So there was a difference between the groups that emerged on big cities and those in smaller villages. Up to May 1882, there were 10,000 members in these groups that were about to help Jews immigrate to Israel. The biggest group of this was called Bilu, Bet Yaakov Lechu Venelcha. Let's go, the house of Jacob. It was first called W, Daber el Bnei Israel ve'isau, talk to the son of Israel and they shall go. So this group was steered by young socialist intellectual Jews. In other Hibat Tzion groups, another activist rose to prominence, Moshe Leib Lilienblum, which functioned as the head of a group of these Hibat Tzion. They also understood that a large number of immigrants were required the authorization of the Ottoman Empire and the Russian government. The Ottomans indeed decided to stop the small wave of these Jewish migrants to Israel after about 1,200 penniless Jews were crowded in Jaffa and tried to buy land from local effendis. Nevertheless, by the end of 1882, a few hundred Jewish immigrants, with the help of local Jews and the yet unorganized Hibat Tzion groups, managed to buy land and start small independent agricultural settlements. The four settlements these first group of Jews managed to inaugurate were Rishon LeZion, erected in the 13th of the 7th, 1882 by unorganized Jews from southern Russia. There was Rosh Pina in the north, 17 to the 9th, 1882 by Hibat Tzion, Romanian Jews. Zichron Yaakov, another one by Romanian Jews, organized under Hibat Tzion, was erected in the 6th of December 1882. And Petach Tikva, which was an earlier settlement, started 5 years before by Jews from Jaffa and was almost abandoned, which was now bolstered by Jewish Russian immigrants. Other groups of settlers waited in Mikveh Israel, an agricultural school in Israel, and waited to settle another barren place. These settlers in Mikveh Israel were quite religious and came from a Ukrainian village, Pavlovka, which was originally meant to transform Jews under the Russian Tsar to be independent farmers. The rabbi of the town Rozhany, which the village of Pavlovka was under his jurisdiction, would later join these farmers with his family, Rabbi Mordechai Gimpel Yaffe. How did the whole thing work? Well, the settlers sold almost all they had and traveled to Odessa. From there, they sent a prospector to survey the land and haggle for a price with a local effendi, an Arab landowner, after getting permits, which were also a costly thing and sometimes required bribes and loopholes because the Ottomans refused to let immigrants buy land. After that, a small number of the would-be immigrants chose those who were more likely to succeed in cultivating the land and living under harsh conditions. These people and their families traveled to Jaffa, talked with the prospector, who stayed there with the help of the local Jewish population in Jerusalem, or Jaffa, or Safed. By the way, Jerusalem at the time had a majority of Jews, something that started since the early 19th century. And then they sent the men to prepare the land for settlement. They built wooden cabins for temporary lodgings and worked all day in tilling the land and building the infrastructure of the settlement. They worked in shifts, and those that were not on shift often returned to their families in Jaffa until their 2-week shift started again. When the infrastructure was sound, they started to build more stable permanent lodgings, while also moving their families to these places. Sometimes, the land they bought also came with Arab serfs who worked under their previous effendi and who helped till the land as part of their serfdom. The land itself was not divided to each settler, but was worked communally. They grew grain, grapes, vegetables, sometimes olives, and they also had some cows and goats. By the end of 1882, there were 480 such settlers on the land they bought. The land itself was about 25 square kilometers. Most settlers were in their 40s, religious, and were married with children, aside from those that came from the Bilu movement, a dozen or so, who were mostly intellectual, young, unmarried, and idealistic in nature. Yet these groups barely survived their first year. The Hibat Tzion groups tried to send them money and tried to negotiate with some Jewish philanthropists to donate money to the groups. There was also a small Jewish agricultural school in Israel, which I mentioned before, Mikveh Israel, which started in 1870, which was part of a larger Jewish effort to make the old Jewish community in the Holy Land more productive, process that started since 1850, that somehow helped to prepare the settlers do agricultural work. All of these groups understood that the settlers barely managed to survive. Most immigrants were integrated into the old Jewish communities in Jerusalem or Jaffa when they saw the hardships of building the new agricultural settlements. Other groups of Jews also came before the settlers in 1881 from Yemen. These Jews, 5,000 in number, settled in Jerusalem and believed that the Messiah will come in 1882 by doing some eschatological extrapolations based on the Song of Songs. This made the big immigration seem dangerous to the Ottoman authorities. The Jewish community numbered 26,000 people in 1880 in the land of Israel, or in the Holy Land, and these numbers became much bigger until 1883, about 10,000 Jewish immigrants. Most of them did not start settlements, but became an economic burden on the backwater infrastructure of Ottoman Israel. The Ottomans decided to bar Jews from immigrating to the Holy Land and to punish Arabs who sold land to Jews for the inauguration of new settlements. By the end of 1882, a Jewish philanthrope from the Rothschild family, the French Baron Edmond, was contacted by the settlers and the religious group of Hibat Tzion, the head of the aforementioned Pavlovkan Jews, Rabbi Shmuel Mohaliver, to take settlers under his wing. The Baron decided to support 100 of them to create a new settlement, and by doing so, he was also contacted by other settlements, already existing ones, especially by a person named Yosef Feinberg, whose family would later become a key element in the Jewish way of life in the new settlements. By 1883, a great tension arose between the unmarried secular youths of the Bilu movement to the more religious settlers of Rishon LeZion. The former didn't want to get the philanthropic support, which meant, according to them, slowly becoming serfs for the Baron, who sent supervisors who slowly became the actual policymakers in the settlement. Groups of Ukrainian Jews bought an abandoned land from German Templars in 1883, and their group, headed by Zalman Levontin, who also inaugurated an office in Jaffa to buy land in the Holy Land, called the new settlement Nes Tziona. In 1888, one of the Nes Tziona settlers, Avraham Yelovsky, would be murdered by Arab raiders and would be the first Jewish casualty in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, even though it is not clear if he was murdered for national reasons or as part of a raid to pillage. In 1883, another Jewish settlement in the northern part of Ottoman Israel was erected after an Algerian Jewish family that lived in Safed buys the land there in 1872 from the Bedouin tribe Azabid next to Ahula Lake. Hibat Tzion from Belarus and Ukraine, called Chevrat Nahala Kerem, buy the land from him and erect a settlement called Yesod HaMa'ala. In the land they started to settle, they found an ancient rock that said in Aramaic, "Everyone who settles here will be remembered for good." In late 1883, the Radomites of Rabbi Mohaliver buy land with the help of the Baron and settle a place next to Rishon LeZion, which they call Ekron. The tension between the Biluim and the more religious settlers in Rishon LeZion convinced them to buy another land and settle it without getting support from the Baron. They called the new settlement Gedera in 1884. All these things happened while the Russian government made more restrictive laws on Jews, failed to suppress the massacres completely, and still blamed the Jews and even encouraged them to leave Russia. During those years, the various Hibat Tzion groups and the settlement they still controlled, not by the Baron who became the actual policymaker in them, were Petach Tikva, Yesod HaMa'ala, and Gedera. All the rest of the settlement came under control of the Baron. Unlike the more private, Baron-owned settlement, the Hibat Tzion groups wanted a more national organization that would navigate the Jewish immigration to Israel. They didn't want just to bolster the Jewish presence in the Holy Land, but also to create diplomatic and economic bases for making the Holy Land a coveted option for Jews who wanted to escape persecution by the government. The Baron settlement were a private economic enterprise that looked more like the efforts of the old Jewish communities in the Holy Land for productivization. All of these national groups decided to unite all the independent Hibat Tzion into a larger movement that could navigate the buying of land and the help to the settlements in a much better and efficient way. The three groups that were most likely to control all the other Hovevei Tzion groups was that of Lilienblum in Odessa, one called Rabinowitz in Warsaw, or Rabbi Mohaliver in Bialystok, of which we have talked before. These groups included the most energetic and influential members of Hovevei Tzion, but they were conflicted on many things. Mohaliver wanted a more religious, simple and conservative form of movement. Lilienblum, a more secular and intellectual figure who was also quite well versed in the Talmud, was for more liberal but middle-class form of movement. And Rabinowitz was for a more radical, young and secular energy that would influence the organization. As each group vied for power, they decided to bring a person from the outside who was very influential of creating many groups of Hovevei Tzion, but who was not part of this group. This person was Yehuda Leib Pinskel, a Jewish doctor and author who wrote a very influential pamphlet in 1882, written in German but translated into Yiddish, that convinced many Jews that the Holy Land is the solution for all of their problems. The name of the pamphlet was Auto-Emancipation, and it inaugurated the whole idea that Jews shouldn't trust in the emancipation they got in Europe, but should bring emancipation to themselves. Pinsker would unite the various different groups of Hovevei Tzion in Katowice in 1884, and they would merge most of them into a more well-coordinated program to send Jews to the Holy Land, buy land, and create settlements. Unlike the previous myriad organizations of Hovevei Tzion, this larger group would try and negotiate with the Russian government and the Ottomans to make the enterprise of Jewish revival in the Holy Land more official. They would take existing groups and offices and will transform them into divisions within this new merged group called Hibat Tzion. The office of Zalman Levontin in Jaffa would become the group's main headquarters in the Holy Land. Two main offices would also emerge, one in Odessa and the other in Warsaw. The Odessa office was the political policy-making center, and the Warsaw one was the administrative one. Another important center of Hibat Tzion was in Bialystok, where the more religious peers of the movement, Rabbi Shmuel Mohaliver and other important rabbis that supported the movement sat, like the Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin from Volozhin, the head of one of the most important rabbinical study centers. The creation of the movement resulted in great bursts of happiness in many Jewish communities around the world, with thousands joining the groups in Europe, including Western Europe. Many small offices for the movement emerged in many big cities throughout Western and Eastern Europe. More and more people promised to donate money to these groups. There was a sense of euphoria. While the movement was called Hibat Tzion, it was not its official name. It was called the Foundation to the Memory of Moshe, after the Jewish philanthropist Moshe Montefiore, a British sir who donated a lot of money to Jews in Israel. This was to show the Russian government that this group had no national tendencies and was just a philanthropic movement to help Jewish refugees in the Holy Land. This did not help. While the Russian government turned a blind eye from the movement and the Ottomans, after some bribes, could ignore several hundred Jews buying land for private purposes, they never gave official recognition to this movement and did not allow its actions would be to create an independent, national, Jewish autonomy in the Holy Land. Nevertheless, there was a lot of hope in the Jewish communities around the world about the success of this movement, and the future of it looked bright. Nobody believed that Hibat Tzion would almost crumble to nothing in the following year and a half. We will continue our discussion of Hibat Tzion and its successes and failures, and how it eventually morphed into the Zionist movement in the next videos.